So if you watch the AD Insight videos I do on athletic director openings, and you know that I think highly of this next guest. Haven Fields Sr. is the Deputy Athletic Director and COO at Nebraska. He came over from Washington 2 years ago with Troy Dannen. And prior to that, I was at Ball State, then spent 6 years at Illinois, really in fundraising and advancement, and goes back to South Alabama ties, a former Auburn football player. Just really can't thank Haven enough for coming on the show. I had to get this episode out because I do see him being an athletic director very soon. And we talked to start it off about what he's proud of at Nebraska. And then we get into really the great ADs he's had the good fortune to work with. Then it kind of shifts more towards mentors and prep on how to not just become an athletic director, but how do you just learn the industry? How do you keep getting better? And that's something that I think is clear with Haven. He's always trying to get better. And he's a man of faith. We talk about family. We talk about decisions on how to move your family for certain opportunities. And so I think you'll get a lot out of this if you're someone also aspiring for that chair. One question I think you'll appreciate, and I've never asked this, is look, becoming an athletic director is competitive. A lot of aspiring ADs are competitive by nature in college athletics. Specifically looking to become an FBS athletic director, it's even more competitive with the number of openings that are there. So I asked Haven, what's that approach like when you know a lot of your industry friends are also going for some of these same jobs? And that's why it comes down to institutional fit, university alignment. Not every person is going to be the right person for a certain job. And so I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. If you do, share it with an industry colleague. I'm excited to introduce Haven Fields Sr. as the next deputy up on higher ed athletics. Okay, Haven, so I'm always curious about the deputies that are also the COO, and what are some things, one or two things that you're most proud of looking back, or that you're currently doing at Nebraska?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking the question, Travis. The thing that I'm most proud of here at Nebraska is just really the team we've assembled in the short time I've been here, almost 2 years later this month. We've really put people in position that I think are positions that I think are really talented across the board, specifically the external teams that I work with. So I'm really excited there, and that's led to some record-breaking years or some that are upcoming as it relates to a lot of our revenue-generating teams, specifically our Huskers Athletic Fund. Really proud of them. They're led by Tyler Kai, Deputy AD for revenue generation, and he's done a really nice job. And the other thing that's really exciting is just the way we've handled things around this basketball season. I'm really proud. It's probably been my most favorite moment to see the run that Fred and his staff have been able to make, with our basketball program and our team supporting them, and the way we've tried to create moments to excite people. One of the things that I really get excited about myself is the way our fans and our supporters have reacted to the year. I misjudged, I'll be honest, how important this was for people to get the first NCAA tournament win, and not only the first, but the second one and close to the third. So it's been a great year, but more importantly, I think the momentum in which we tried to take and create through stories and opportunities for our fans to feel like they're really close to it, and they're obviously the team behind the team. Those are the things that really excited me this year. And the only other thing I'll add is throughout my career, being as young as I was at the University of South Alabama, being a part of a startup football program when I was still learning the industry was really, really good for me. And it obviously put me in a position to not only be a fundraiser, but obviously understand the integral parts of what it means to be a part of an athletics department and to start something new. And it is a lot of work, a lot of strategy, but a lot of rewards too.
Another week of higher ed athletics and another partnership announcement with AD Vantage. People are finally figuring out why I partnered with them, why Tanner Stump and his team have created the Moneyball of college athletic departments. Clemson, Louisville, Charlotte, Boise State, Coastal Carolina, North Texas, Missouri State, and Indiana State have all made the decision to partner with AD Vantage. If Tanner Stump had to describe what the company was and what it did for athletic directors, it'd be Moneyball. Not because it replaces those experts with spreadsheets, but because it helps leadership teams make smarter resource decisions that actually translate into winning. Look at the coach effect score. So when you zoom out across the industry, there's definitely no shortage of data, but there is a lack of context with that data. You can see what programs are spending, but not always what they're getting in return. So AD Vantage, they start to connect those dots for you. I read you the list of partners. There's probably going to be another one soon. Why not you? Your competitors probably have already talked to them. College athletics is a decision sport. Make the right one and contact AD Vantage. Tell them Travis from Higher Ed Athletics sent you. What we're just kind of thinking of, you've worked for some incredible athletic directors, and I'm not going to name them all here because it wouldn't fit on the screen, and you can obviously mention them as well. But, Troy Dannen might be the most, so I listen to pretty much everything athletic directors put out. That's like just part of studying it. And he was on, I think, a Cal's podcast several months ago, and I was locked in. I listened to it twice. Such a straight shooter, great insights if people were paying attention. But you also worked for really good athletic directors in Beth Goetz. When you were at Ball State, she's obviously now leading the Hawkeyes. Also had another a really good basketball season with men's basketball, and then Josh Whitman, who I think is finally getting some of the credit nationally that maybe of how great of an AD and he is with, he handpicked Roger Denny and at Illinois that led to Oklahoma. And so what have you kind of learned from getting to, study, sit next to working for these athletic directors in your career, all the way back to South Alabama and Alabama and Auburn?
Yeah, so I would start with one that's not on the page. You mentioned Troy and Beth and Josh, but I'm forever grateful to Jay Jacobs, longtime AD at Auburn, who I'm not in the industry if it's not for Jay and him having belief in me along with a few others to just say, hey, we think this is a career that you can have and be around it for a long time. And he was just so genuine with the way he built relationships with people. And again, he was a fundraiser, so I think that was obviously a really important piece of it for him. And I'm just grateful in the way he would always connect with people, and it was genuine. So I'm grateful to be able to learn from him in those regards. But I'm really grateful for Joe Gottfried, who who was instrumental in me having a chance to be at South Alabama, longtime AD, had a lot of success bringing football to the institution. Giving me a chance to understand some of the business components of it and not just, the external side of things, as it relates to fundraising or marketing. He was really gracious in the thought of being patient. I thought he had great patience in the way that he would go about his day to day, and learned a lot from him as someone that was really young in the industry at the time and was just full of energy and wanting to get things done all the time, and just being really methodical. And again, the patience was really important. Dr. Joel Erdman, who came in after him and just kind of enhanced my role, was extremely smart. He was great at just really bringing people together and thinking about the bigger picture. But he was a guy who was an old school AD. He just worked. I'll never forget the time I was out, at Lad People Stadium, and I was working with a couple of graduate assistants. And Joel, being a Division II AD, he came out knowing he had a meeting after, and he helped us with some of the banners we were putting on the rails of the old Lad People Stadium, and again, it just showed the fact that he was willing to not only tell someone things they need to be doing, but he was also willing to get in the trenches with them. So I'm grateful in those regards with him, and I can't say enough about Josh Whitman, one of the most transformational leaders I've ever been around. In his time at Illinois, even before him, I saw three. If you count interims, Travis, I saw three chancellors, three provosts, three ADs, three football coaches, three basketball coaches. But lo and behold, as Josh Whitman took the reins, things got better. And again, just the way in which he put a vision together was really impressive for everybody to understand which way we need to be going as an organization. Was extremely impressive. Beth, somewhat of a quiet introvert. Beth is, again, one of the best leaders I've ever been around. She pushed me in a way that it's only helped me, to become a better leader myself. And one of the best critical thinkers I've ever been around in the day-to-day of understanding the entire situation in which direction we need to go next. And so was really grateful for her in those regards. Um, Somewhat of a strategist as far as Troy Dannen is concerned. He is, the epitome of where we are in college athletics. I say often we're building a plane while we're flying it. And Troy's the guy that's probably controlling it in some way, specifically for what we're doing and steering us in the right direction and just thinking, 5, 10 steps ahead in where we take our department and looking at several options and challenging our leadership team in that way. So he's been really instrumental, specifically the last 2 stops as it relates to Washington and Nebraska, and just forever grateful for all of them and all those things that I mentioned that they've certainly gave me some things to think through as it relates to my own leadership style.
Yeah, and clearly he thinks highly of you of bringing you to Washington and then getting you to pack up and come to Nebraska, which I know you've documented in other interviews, and he probably has too about that change. So we won't go into that, but I mentioned that I pretty much watch everything people put out. I just did a big press conference study, like AD film study, because I think athletic directors or aspiring ADs need to be, reading or the scripts or whatever of the press conferences. So how do you best learn whenever you're trying to consume information from maybe the people that you don't work with? Obviously, this is always a shout out for the D1 ticker. I think everyone starts their day there, but like, are you listening to interviews? You watching press conference? What's Haven Field Senior's study habits like with that?
Yeah, I like many. I've got mentors, but more so, I have a board of directors of people that I call and spend time with. Obviously, I've been around some really great leaders that we just discussed that I can certainly pick up the phone and call and have conversation with as it relates to what's taking place in our industry. You mentioned the D1 ticker, but having a chance to connect with a lot of these ads by phone, by Zoom, is really important. And I think another key piece of this for me, Travis, is when I do go to these conferences or symposiums, I try to handpick a few ads that I can spend time with and have real dialogue around how they see the industry, more so where things are for them. And it's always different. You can be at one institution and obviously things are being handled at the other a little differently. But I try to make sure that I'm leaning on people that I trust. I mentioned the board of directors. Shout out to Bob Bodine for his book, The Power of Who, one of my favorites. And I'll never forget that, just being able to make sure that I keep people around me that are not going to tell me things that I want to hear, but challenge me in a way. So that's a lot of it for me. I do think the press conferences have been valuable, specifically for some of the ADs that have recently been hired, some that I know well and some that I don't. But just the way in which they portray themselves as high, integrity individuals, but more so their vision for the programs and just the things that matter the most to them. You see a plethora of information that's being put out, but that's kind of my approach in how I learn. I try to truly spend time and connect with the people. And there's several ADs that I didn't mention. Dave Benedict is a guy that I speak to from time to time. Ross Bjork is another guy. There's so many that I can connect with just to get information, and they're willing to share it and always willing to make time.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, Ross was the first athletic director on Higher Ed Athletics pre-COVID, and talk about someone that's just willing to give up his time, helping me get started. So I'll always be. And then, I was hoping maybe here in Indy I'd run into to Dave Benedict, but didn't see him. Hopefully, get him on the podcast at some time as well. You also mentioned Bob Bodine, and also shout out. That's a great book. I remember watching him speak whenever he gave that, I think at NACDA. And then, the two chairs. Anyone that knows what I'm building with Higher Ed Athletics knows that, Bob Bodine and his faith and his leadership of his business is pretty much what this is trying to model after, years from now. So that's just a little shout out for that. And then I also tell people if they haven't watched or read my post, AD film study, I looked at Brian Blair at Syracuse. I looked at Ryan Berryman, New Mexico, Kevin White at Charlotte, and Roger Tinney at Oklahoma. Watched all their breakdown films like I was like a football coach watching film or something. That's like the idea of it. But you can learn a lot from that. So thanks for that insights. I appreciate that. say it every time. I partner with Onrise.care because I care about college athletes. I spent 10 years working in athletic academic support. I know how much importance you have to place on mental health. Think about all the pressures our athletes are facing. Coming out of high school, adjusting to college is enough stress for anybody. Now all of a sudden you throw in the transfer portal. You throw in even more expectations. Just the concern of being an athlete in season, out of season, making friends, making connections, finishing that degree, staying eligible, actually performing in your sport. All of these are everyday concerns for college athletes. I know you care about your college athletes too. Some of you listening, your department may not be able to afford the support. So that's why I partner with Onrise to make sure you're aware that you can have one call, same day setup, immediate athlete access to licensed clinicians, retired pros, and 24/7 crisis care. It's going to be very affordable for you, less than what you would spend on one full-time employee in-house. No hiring hassles, no initiative fatigue. And let me just say, the passion Kim has for this business is why you have to go to onrise.care. Tell them that Travis from Higher Ed Athletics sent you. Check out their website and see why you can start providing access to mental health for your athletes, because I know how much you care about them. Well, I want to switch to your decision-making process. You are, for one, I love that you mentioned how you got started in a fundraising career, and I know that was like where you got started, and that's kind of like that foundation has now allowed you to go and pick up other things too without people saying, well, he doesn't have fundraising experience. Well, no, that's where he got started. So it's already embedded in everything you do, I imagine. Because, some people that don't understand the direction of the athletic director role, they're like, well, wait, he's not a fundraiser. Well, you already been doing that for, probably almost a decade before you switched to this, or at least half a decade. So I think that's awesome. But I'm just kind of curious, like, you're a man that's going to have and probably has had opportunities. You obviously made the decision to, go to Nebraska after going to Washington, and just, I know the steps you've had in your career, but like, how do you and your wife evaluate opportunities? What kind of goes into this career design that I imagine you had mentioned you want to be an athletic director? How do you go about like designing this career? Because I know Kevin White, the former legendary AD, at Notre Dame and Duke, he was this was kind of his buzzword in his book about designing your career.
Yeah, I think it's great to be able to talk through career design. And, as you mentioned, Kevin White, one of the titans in our industry, I'll never forget something he said that obviously could be a part of this conversation as well, as you think about steps you're taking and what it means to be at a certain institution. And he kept saying that there was two things that you can't delegate. And he talked about politics and leadership. And I think that's part of our industry. That's part of who we are. That's going to be a part of any institution that you attend. But I just mentioned that because that has impacted me as I think about my career in the future and just even decisions that I make as part of an organization. But when you think about the decision-making process as opportunities come about, my family is extremely important to me. My wife, my two boys, now, there was a time where we didn't have them and we made a couple of moves, but now that they're part of part of it all, we obviously have to sit and think about not only what's best for us, but what's best for them. I think about the personal opportunity and what it means to be a part of a community, because when you're making these moves, it obviously impacts everyone. That's a part of the process. I think the other thing that is obviously important to me as I think about when I'm having the chance to look through a process is, what does the alignment look like on campus with athletics? I think that's so important, led by a president or a chancellor, and how they view athletics and how they support it. Because any successful leader has to have the support it needs around them. And the people are so important in that process. And so that's first and foremost from a professional standpoint. Obviously you want to look at opportunities where there's been success on a campus, there's been success in athletics, and just thinking about what it means to be a part of an organization, what it means to continue to enhance the things that they've done so well, when you're thinking about the people that you're going to work with on a daily basis. And then, I mentioned this earlier, but, not only the support from campus, not only the things that are happening within the department to that where there's been some success and you get the opportunity to enhance it. I think the other piece of that again is certainly community driven for me. When my wife and I become a part of a city, we're going to be extremely involved, and so I want to be somewhere where that is obviously welcomed for me, and being a part of community, whether that's me being a part of a board, me joining an organization that I can help support, and just thinking through what that will mean, not only for us, but the in which we are trying to also make sure that our boys understand the importance of it. So those are three things that matter. Now there's a lot of other things within the department that I could think about, but I mentioned culture. I mentioned the importance of making sure expectations are laid out not only from campus but and how I do that myself. So there's a lot of things that I can talk through, but those three things I mentioned just because I think that they hit every level of if you're at an institution and what it means to be a part of it and what you're looking for.
Yeah, and that's more of like also I feel like the D1 dossiers are great. I think they're incredible. This is more of like the qualitative side of it. You have to, as a family, you have to think about the schools, the neighborhoods. Like what's the city like? Is there a church? Can I find a good church that I want to be a part of? All those things that maybe like
Very important.
even if you're not in college athletics, this is what everyone thinks of if you're moving, right? And like the emotional toll on, like, I don't know if your kids are old enough for like elementary school yet, but like that's a challenge too. Like we just moved from one town over to move back to our hometown, and I was a nervous wreck telling my 10-year-old that hey, we're switching schools and moving, and so I always ask people about that, like the emotional toll. But like it's just
Yeah.
not as easy. I mean, credit to you all that I know kids are adaptive and they'll adapt to the setting, but that puts a lot of pressure on a marriage, on an individual making a career move to go somewhere where they don't know people other than maybe the AD that is recruiting them there. So
Yeah.
kudos to you all.
Yeah, there's 7 and 9, and again, when we were moving from Illinois to into Indiana for me to work at Ball State, they were young, they were two, and the youngest wasn't even one. So the moves are always different too, depending on the timing.
Yeah.
As right now, again, they're 7 and 9, so this next move it'll probably look a little different, just because again they've really enjoyed Lincoln and they've made a lot of friends, and we've done the same over the course of almost 2 years now. So that looks different than it did at one time. So there's these segments depending on the timing of their ages from a personal perspective and what happens.
I've asked people also about, do you keep, it used to be like, oh, you get a binder of notes. I think now people obviously have gone to digital, but like when you read a clipping in the SBJ or an article in the D1 ticker or something like that, are you like collecting that? Are you like writing out ideas from conferences and just like basically all in one central location? Like, I'm just kind of curious from tactical insights of how you best, just keep learning with the physical learning.
Yeah, I do. I'm a big notes guy from my phone. I'm more in the electronics than I am in the paper, for sure. So I always focus on anything that I hear at conferences. I take notes. Cal's I've got notes from the last, I don't know, 5 6 years of just information that I keep. And then the same thing with the conferences that I attend, even when I'm at NACTA in an active role as a committee member for NAD, but I'm still sitting in sessions. I'm still taking notes in my phone. It's just become so much easier now with all the apps that you have. There's things you can record, there's things that you can write down and save. And so I use my phone a lot, and I try to create folders that I can, add notes into, based on the topic or subject. And I can always go back and reference them. And I think our industry is full of ideas. Some of us are hearing certain things from one institution, and we're finding ways to implement portions of that into what we're doing. And I think that's part of it, that we're continuing to learn from each other. So that's kind of the approach I have. When you hear something, you get the chance to just write it down, and I use my phone for it a lot just because of the technology component.
So you've also been at very different places. We've talked about it. We've covered it here. The budgets at like in Illinois, Washington, and Nebraska are even different. But let alone a South Alabama, Ball State. Just kind of curious, like how do you think that's going to help you when you decide or to pursue an AD job, or you just do become an AD, I mean, you might be at any of those type of budgets, and budget creation and or revenue is obviously critical. Well, your numbers might be much smaller than it is, as the number two in Nebraska. So how is those other experiences going to help prepare you for a vastly different FBS landscape?
What it boils down to is, decision making, right? You think about how you handle things within a department. And, as you mentioned, I've seen schools where, we're probably less resourced than others. And I think what it still boils down to is, what's best for the department, what's best for the institution. And more so, as you're making those decisions, how are those resources that we're using going to help us take it to the next level, whether that's more about wins or sustaining success. I think we've got to think long and hard about that, and then understand the people that are a part of that process, and how they're being or how they're handling the process themselves, the decision making, as it relates to how those resources are being used, is what it really boils down to. I think the other big difference is at a South Alabama, there's times where we have coaches that we're trying to work closely with, and we've got hard decisions to make from time to time because there's just things that we probably cannot do based on the resources. Where when you're at a place like a Nebraska or Illinois, you've got more resources, so you have the ability to do more than that one. You probably could do two or three, but I still think across the board, it's also important to think about what we're doing to make the best decision possible. And again, how is that going to help us sustain success? And then more so, just thinking about what are we trying to do as a department overall. So I think that's kind of the vast difference. There's ones with less zeros versus the other. I mean, that's the simplistic way of saying it. But I think decision making becomes a factor when you start to think about the budgets, and specifically because of how we're obviously spending money right now, and the things we're doing for student athletes, and departments are being asked to do so much more, whether that be to generate more revenue, or just to think about ways that, depending on what schools you're at, like we may reallocate in some ways because there's not going to be more money to generate, or we probably don't have as much. So I think it boils down to the decision making from a budgetary perspective, on what's really important versus what may not be at the time.
Yeah, in some places, some sports now that you can invest more heavily in maybe one, like, you know, Nebraska is known for volleyball, right? Dominant volleyball. Well, that might be a different sport somewhere else that outside of the basketballs and the football. It might be baseball, it might be softball, like at an
100%.
Oklahoma. I think that's a critical piece too. Is now more than ever you can decide what as a department you're going to go in on, and your budget might be different, but maybe you allocate differently because of your your legendary sport that you might have on campus. So
Yeah.
I
There's
appreciate that.
decision making, and then there's, to your point, there's priorities, right? I think every department has probably sat down at some point and they prioritized sports to a certain degree, which could drive how you obviously spend, how you obviously decide to spend money, or what your budgets look like for certain sports or units.
Well, as we round it out here, this is a more serious question. Then I'll end it with a more of a fun one that I'm adding. But so, athletic administrators like yourself, especially former college athletes like yourself, former football player at Auburn, competitive by nature, right? And now, when we look at clearly, some people are pursuing AD jobs or they're building up their career. Obviously, really good at what you're doing in your day job. That's the most critical piece. But maybe just talk about like we talked about industry colleagues and how you all keep in touch, but like I keep obviously a D1 AD hiring tracker on my website, and as we are recording, there's been two changes just in this conversation. But it is a very competitive road to become, let alone an AD, but an FBS AD. So what's that like? Just being a competitive, but you're obviously still rooting for your industry friends, but at the same time navigating your own career decisions. I imagine it's just the competition is probably something you all love, but like maybe you don't see it as competition, but you just see it as your faith driven path or whatever. But like, I'm just kind of curious your insights on that comment that I just made.
So a couple of things. I am extremely competitive, but I also realize that fit, timing, those things do matter in these searches, along with, obviously being able to cast your vision and obviously connecting with, a president or a chancellor is extremely important, and, maybe even some key leaders on campus. But I've always felt like, again, I'm a faith driven individual who feels like, when my time comes, I'll be ready for it, and excited about the opportunity. But I'm also really grateful, and for others that have had opportunities or getting opportunities. It's exciting to see our industry, continue to take a look at the new wave of leaders that are certainly going to be a part of our industry for some time and take it to the next level. As you and I both know, this new landscape, you've got to have people who are forward thinking and who are part of the solution and not the problem. And I think that's the focus for a lot of this new wave of leaders. And so, as competitive as I am, Travis, I'm certainly excited for the industry because of the people that I know who are part of these searches and are going to have great opportunities as well.
Yeah, and getting to know more deputies and the private conversation with ADs and deputies, realizing just how difficult choices it must be to make some of these decisions. Because, I mean, I keep like a list of 10 in my notebook of like for fit, obviously, like people will ask me like who I think the next Toledo AD is going to be or something like that now because I've gotten a few of them right, but it's like it's so difficult, and one person might be good for one type of job and one might be best for another, and we're seeing that across the board now about fit. I think fit and alignment, you mentioned alignment earlier in the conversation with the university, two of the most critical things I think right now. Just preparation can get you so far, but the alignment and fit's got to be right, so I think that's great.
Yeah.
So
No.
I want to end it on more of a fun one. I love when the D1 ticker, I'm sure they'll put their podcast lists out soon, and maybe Higher Ed Athletics. I think last year I was on like 4 or 5 ADs, so maybe more people have listened. But I love seeing the vast different of books and the different podcasts. So the Good Sport, as if you're watching, I'm holding that up. It was a Good Son and Danny White picked it, but I noticed that Brian did not, or at least he didn't put it in there. But it's a great book that if anyone is aspiring to be an AD or your current AD, oh my gosh, I mean, I read it in a day. It was so good. And then I had him on for about an hour and a half conversation on the podcast after he wrote the book. But just kind of curious, like what are some books that you like to read or some podcasts? You don't have to mention both if you lean more heavily, but I'm thinking of maybe things that people aren't aware of that maybe could be a really good resource.
Yeah, I think I've read a lot of books over the years. Measure What Matters by John Doerr, I think, is a really good book. As far as others, I mentioned The Power of Who. That's just one again because it got me started in my industry. I think for the younger professionals, I think to take a hard look at it. You think about your network and people that what people that I think you're trying to connect with and find ways to get to know in an intentional manner. As far as podcasts, I mean, there are several. The one that I think is most relevant right now is there's a guy who is actually he teaches over at the law school at Tulane, and Troy.
Gabe Feldman.
Gabe Feldman, his podcast I think has been outstanding for me to listen to. Just knowing that, again, he's providing a lot of information with a lot of different industry leaders that have several opinions on where things are, and some more factual than not in the information that they're providing. And so that's been fun to listen to. And I think the Cal's podcast, shout out to Will Reese and all the work he's done. It's been phenomenal just because you get so many different leaders, whether they're deputies, ADs, chief revenue officers. You've got a lot of different people who are providing their thoughts as it relates to our industry, where they see us headed, and the things that they're working towards to make sure their institutions are in the right place at the right time, given where things are. So those are some from when I think about books, when I think about podcasts right now where I am, and I'm probably listening to a lot more podcasts and reading books right now. So those are probably the two leaders for me because of the timing in which things are and just the busyness in which I think we all live right now of our industry and the work we're trying to do. So
Havenfield Senior, Deputy AD and COO of the Cornhuskers at Nebraska. Thanks so much for joining me on Hired Athletics.
Thank you for having me, Travis. I really enjoyed the discussion.